It is my greatest pleasure to announce our keynote speaker, who is Dr. V. Shukla, who is the Senior Program Manager at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where she leads the Discovery Investment Portfolio for Ag Development. I met V at Dow AgriSciences, where she spent over a decade developing their biotech platform and also developing a really key gene editing tool, which is the subject of one of our panels here, called the Exact Technology Platform, which she published on in Nature a few years back. V and I worked together to commercialize and license that technology, and we had a blast doing it. So V studied, got her undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon University, and received her PhD from Washington University here in St. Louis, so she has ties to St. Louis. And she's going to talk to us today about how you can translate these science and technology innovations into impactful tools that can actually help the development of agriculture in the developing world. So V?
Well, thank you, Sharon, for the introduction. It's always a little nerve-wracking when an old friend volunteers to introduce you. You don't know what they're going to say. But I want to thank the organizers, Larta and our friends here at Danforth, for putting together this great conference and hosting it in this beautiful facility. Before I dive into my talk, there's an issue that has come up a few times during the course of the meeting that I'd like to just address and clarify. So for the record, even though we share the same last name, Rohit and I are not related. He's not my husband, he's not my son, he's not my nephew, and he's sure as hell not my daddy. That being said, when Larta reached out to me and asked me if I'd be open to sharing some of the work we do at the Gates Foundation with y'all, Rohit was really quite explicit about what my assignment was. He said to me, Vipula, what we really need from you, my dear, is inspiration. I'm really not sure that I'm going to be able to deliver on that promise. But what I will share with you is that the people who inspire me in my work at the Gates Foundation and really throughout my career in the private sector as well are farmers. And they're some of the smartest, coolest people on the planet. So here's to them. Okay. So I think what I'd like to do to start out is, maybe it's a little bit shocking, point you to one of the underlying principles and beliefs that we have at the Gates Foundation, which is shown here on the slide today, and tell you that we are a development organization. We are not an aid organization. At the Gates Foundation, we're not here to help people. Okay. We're not here to help people. We're not here to feed people. We're here to solve problems so that people can help and feed themselves. Every person deserves the chance to live a healthy and productive life, and we know that agriculture and food security are a big part of that. So we take a systems approach to solving problems in the sector. Okay, let's see. And the way we decide what we're going to work on is really a two-step process. The areas of greatest need, the opportunity for us to have the greatest impact, and where those intersect. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the foundation broadly, and then focus in on the Ag Development Program that I'm a part of, and tell you about what we work on and how we work. And hopefully that will inspire you a little bit. So we are the largest private family foundation in the world. We have offices throughout the world. The mothership is based in Seattle, which is where I work. And to give you a sense of the scale of our investment, here are some numbers for you. Just last year, in 2015, we paid out $4.2 billion in grant payments. Now, most of the work that we do is in grants. And this kind of shows you the allocation across our total financial resource. Global development, which I'll go into a little bit more, includes the agriculture program. But I'm sure you've heard in the media and in the news about some of our efforts in global health, which includes things like polio elimination, malaria vaccination, primarily infectious diseases that disproportionately affect those in the developing world. We have a US program that also focuses on K through 12, as well as programs and divisions sort of across platforms and across programs that are support for communication and so on. So in addition to the financial resources that are outlined in this slide, I know it's of interest to this community. We have a separate pot of money that we use for a tool called PRIs, or Program-Related Investments. And this is actually a $1.5 billion fund. It's not fully allocated yet, that we can use to employ alternative financial instruments. So seed funding, equity funding, loan guarantees, volume guarantees, other non-grant investments. And we find this to be actually a very useful tool for our engagement with the private sector. PRI is a legal term, comes from the US tax code. And the important thing to know about it is that every dollar that is spent out of the PRI fund, and indeed out of our grant resource allocation, has to be directly and clearly aligned to our global objectives and our strategic objectives, and has a clear definition as a charitable expenditure, okay? So we are a big organization, lots of people, lots of money. As I mentioned, we have a diversity of programs across the foundation. The foundation just celebrated its 15th anniversary. It started out actually with our US programs, which Bill Gates Sr., Bill Gates' dad, initiated prior to when Bill and Melinda left Microsoft. He was somewhat discouraged by what he considered the deplorable state of the US education system and told his son, okay, give me some of your money and I'm going to do something. As the foundation grew over time, the co-chairs, Bill and Melinda Gates, left their positions at Microsoft. This is their full-time job. And programs in global health, as I mentioned, which focuses on infectious diseases, global development, which I'll talk more about, and policy and communications were implemented and built up into the foundation. Not only did we celebrate our 15th anniversary this year, but Bill Gates Sr., Bill's dad, celebrated his 90th birthday. And I can tell you he's still very active. He eats lunch in the cafeteria every day. He's really tall. You can't miss him. And he is really our moral compass, our North Star at the Gates Foundation. Global development includes agricultural development, which I'll go into a lot more detail about. But in addition, we look at some of the systemic problems that prevent economic and development from occurring in third world countries. So we have family planning, financial services for the poor, which includes microfinance and online banking, for example, and some health issues for which these are not infectious diseases per se that require innovation, but they are areas where there has been a disproportionate allocation of that innovation into the developing world. So, for example, polio vaccines, they exist, we know they work, we just need to get them out there. And we consider that a development problem, because unless these problems are solved, a country isn't able to sort of take advantage of opportunities for economic and social development. Agricultural development is the largest component of the Global Development Program at the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation, which I may shorthand as BMGF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is only one of many, many investors that participate and contribute in this space. So we have a lot of partnerships with multilateral donors, national governments, research funding agencies, other foundations, and the private sector. Although we're the largest private family foundation in the world, our resources are a drop in the bucket compared to what is necessary and sufficient to drive global development and particularly agricultural development. And so we work very closely and with partners. And one of our objectives is to catalyze investment by some of these other entities and everyone. So the more money and the more brains focused on the kinds of problems we are trying to solve, the better. So we view that as one of the most important roles that we can play, and that's part of the focus of our global policy and advocacy team, is to kind of spread the message, evangelize a little bit, and incite and catalyze and incentivize other funders, other donors, other agencies to contribute to the solution space. As I mentioned, we work through partners, and we have kind of a role that we play in terms of being able to catalyze those other partners, but we also work directly with them in the programs and in developing and implementing our own strategies. So what we are able, as a private family foundation, to bring to the table, obviously the money, our resources, and we do have multiple instruments, as I mentioned, and a lot of flexibility. Because we're not a government agency, we can be creative, let's say, with our financing. Our voice, particularly of our co-chairs, Bill and Melinda Gates, and our executive leadership team, which is led by our CEO, Sue Desmond-Hellman, who, by the way, is an oncologist and comes from both the private sector and academic sectors. In some ways, they're almost virtual heads of state. So we take full advantage of and very carefully steward and manage how we deploy our voice in not only the media, but in important circles where decisions get made. And then there's our people, grunts like me, staff who actually do the work and bring some domain expertise into the decision making, into the investment strategies, and into the making and managing of those specific investments. Obviously, we can't do it alone. We're 1,400 people, a couple of offices. So we rely on our grantees and partners to be the center and the core of our work. We try and work very collaboratively as we're developing these strategies and initiatives, and we are sometimes to, I would say, our detriment in constant, continuous improvement cycles. So we do a lot of experiments, and sometimes it gets a little distracting, I'll be perfectly honest with you, but we're always looking on how to continually improve the work that we do. As a young foundation, we want to be innovative, we want to learn from the past and the history of global development and philanthropy, and we want to kind of bring some new thinking to the sector. So the underlying fundamental principle of our agricultural development strategy is that in order to achieve the economic transformation of a country or of a region, a prerequisite is that you achieve agricultural transformation. So you can't have one without the other. And agricultural transformation is a hugely powerful economic lever in the regions where we work. I love this quote from Bill, not because it's just about agriculture, but it really represents a global view of how economies and development works. We spend a lot of time studying global development, past examples, history. And what that data tells us is that in every single case, when a country or a region sort of crossed that tipping point from being not competent to achieve economic transformation to moving onto that pathway, it was because agriculture had been improved, had been transformed, and had provided an economic base for that transformation. 75% of the world's poor live in rural areas, and most of them are farmers. And they're the smartest, most creative people I've ever met. It builds self-sufficiency for individuals and communities. And really, as I've been trying to communicate all along, if you want to reduce rural poverty, agricultural productivity is an extremely effective lever. So the people that we're targeting are the extreme rural poor. These are our clients. This is our target demographic and our intended beneficiaries. And there's a lot of them. And we focus particularly on the 800 million or so smallholder farmers. I'll tell you more about those in a few minutes. So as we look at, as I said, we like to study history and do a lot of analysis. And as we look at some of the challenges that we face, which I don't need to re-articulate to this audience, probably some of you have seen this slide or slides a lot like it. Even if we assume that the existing growth in agricultural productivity, and in this case, this is just cereal or crop yield, even if we assume that it continues on the same trajectory it's been on, which has been remarkable since the Green Revolution, really. If we compare that trajectory in the solid lines to the projected need based on these megatrends in the dotted lines, we see there's a gap. So even though we're doing a lot of cool stuff in the breeding and agronomy spaces, and really breeding has been revolutionized in the molecular era, those conventional approaches are just not going to get us there. These are decent trends, but they're just not going to get us there. And unfortunately, the experiences, the benefits, the yield increases that we've seen are disproportionately allocated globally. So all of these productivity gains that are experienced, for example, here in Missouri and Iowa and the American Midwest or in California, are not being experienced in the developing world. So there's another gap there. There's the absolute gap and there's the geographic gap. So we focus on the developing world. Our strategy, as I mentioned, is driven on the concept of agricultural transformation. And we try and take a vertically integrated value chain approach to that. So we don't just focus on R&D. We have, within our agricultural development program and team, expertise, attention, and effort focused across the value chain, everything from discovery research, which is my area of focus, all the way to creating markets for the poor. If they are able to achieve surplus, they need someplace to sell, and the link to nutrition and family health. We focus on some priority geographies because we believe, A, this is where there's the biggest opportunity for agricultural improvement, and these are geographies where if we can drive agricultural transformation, it bleeds over into a more regional effect. So the hectareage under cultivation in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Tanzania, coupled with the kinds of productivity gaps that are experienced there, define them as some of our priority geographies with an expectation of spillover into the West and East Africa region. The same is true for the South Asian continent. So across this value chain here, from the early stage work, we're really focused on creating global public goods. And at a geographic and country level, we want to have country-specific outcomes, particularly around financial services or policies that can facilitate the dissemination of those global goods, get them in farmers' fields. When we're trying to figure out what to invest in, we focus on and try and identify the biggest opportunities to drive productivity. Because we take this very comprehensive approach to the ag sector, we're going to look at both socioeconomic factors as well as yield constraints, as well as practices. And for any given crop, and in this graph, don't get too hung up on the numbers. This is just yield gap as a percentage of average smallholder farmer yield by constraint category. If any one of these crops, we try and identify what are the areas within these categories, socioeconomic, et cetera, where our investment can actually have an impact, and try and kind of prioritize and build a portfolio around that. Our priority clients, again, our intended beneficiaries, are smallholder farmers. And we have a very intentional and very, I would say, strong focus, particularly on women farmers. So a couple of years ago, Melinda Gates wrote a wonderful essay for Science magazine, which was entitled, "Putting Women and Girls at the Center of Development." And that position and our strategic focus on women smallholder farmers is driven by a lot of data. We're really wonky. So some of the data points that help drive that focus are the facts that women comprise at least half of the farmers in the developing world, And a vast majority of the economically active women are farmers. The data also tells us that when women farmers generate income, they reinvest that income into the well-being of their families and households, as opposed to the local beer bar. And based on social and cultural practices, women are the predominant keepers of livestock in Africa as well. So here's just, this is a broad generalization, but here's a sort of example of what a smallholder women farmer situation looks like. She's dealing with an annual income of a little over $300 US dollars a year, typically holding 1 to 2 hectares that she is farming for subsistence farming, and will farm multi-crops. So one example of intercropping that you see quite often is a little bit of maize, sorghum, and cassava. So this is our target demographic. I would also tell you that at the Gates Foundation, we have a sort of implicit belief that if you want to get something done, get a woman to do it. So within ag development, we focus on both crops and livestock. And I'm just going to give you a snapshot of our livestock strategy. The geographies are what I told you before, in that we focus on East and West Africa with some first-tier priority countries that are anticipated to have spillover effects. You know, the country boundaries are a little bit artificial when it comes to agriculture, but they're important for policy reasons because government is hugely involved and influential in the enterprise in the developing world. We focus on dairy cattle, mostly goats, a little bit of sheep for small ruminants, and chickens. We love chickens. And chickens eat bugs. For those of you who were there at the earlier talk. Our functions for the livestock team are kind of analogous to what we do on the global health side of things for that other species, Homo sapiens, in that we focus on livestock health. Okay, we don't do genetics and reproduction that much with human beings, but we do with livestock. And we focus on production and markets for these priority commodities. It's kind of a challenge to work with livestock in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly because many of the keepers of livestock are pastoralists. So they are not landholders per se, but they will roam around and pick up cattle where they can. And it's really quite an interesting challenge to work in the livestock space. But we've got a terrific team with veterinarians and policy experts on our livestock group within our agricultural development program that implements this work. So when we're thinking about the crops that we want to focus on in our target geographies, one of the first things we have to ask is, well, what do people grow? So here's just a snapshot, and this is data from UNFAO, that on a hectareage basis tells you what the distribution of crops is across both sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And I want to point out a couple of things that might be surprising to this particular audience. If you look across the diversity in sub-Saharan Africa, there's no soybean there. Okay, it's not a major crop in the region. Everybody wants to be a maize farmer because maize is a cash crop, but not everyone can afford to be a maize farmer. And most of the crops you see here are either grown for on-farm consumption or for sale in the local informal markets. In South Asia, the situation is a little bit different. Rice is the predominant crop for cultural reasons, and wheat is also quite important. So the first thing we do, of course, is look and say, well, what do people actually grow? Like, what crops do we need to focus on? And then we focus on those that are primarily food staples for that demographic I was describing to you, the smallholder woman farmer. So here's the list. Everyone always wants to know, what crops do you guys focus on? Here you go. Cereals, small grains and legumes, and roots and tubers and bananas for sub-Saharan Africa, and a somewhat different distribution among cereals and legumes in India and Bangladesh. So we focus on research and development, we focus on seed systems, we focus on financing for farmers who grow these crops, all those components of the value chain for these specific crops. And I will tell you, coming from the Midwest and the big seed industry, it was quite a learning curve to me. I had never seen a cassava plant before joining the Gates Foundation. You can see them here at the Danforth Center, so if you have a chance, ask them. So we have a model for sustainable development, and I want to take a second to kind of help you understand what we mean by the word sustainable, because it gets used a lot, and it means different things to different people. For us, since we're looking in agricultural development at productivity gains, sustainable, we want those gains to be sustainable, meaning that they have to be technically, culturally, and economically viable over time. So what we mean by technically is that it has to work under the growing conditions that are relevant in the agroecologies that we focus on. Culturally, meaning that they have to be adoptable by the smallholder farmers who are going to use them. And there are both social as well as knowledge-based limitations to that. And by economically viable, we mean that it has to be self-sustaining. When we exit, when we discontinue our funding, it has to be able to be perpetuated. So many of you may not know, the Gates Foundation actually has a predetermined sunset date. We will not exist in perpetuity. 20 years after both Bill and Melinda have left this earth, the Gates Foundation ceases to exist. Any of the endowment and the funds that haven't been spent down revert back to the family trust. So we have a sense of urgency to spend the money. And I never have had a problem personally spending money, but I will tell you that it's hard to spend it and spend it wisely, and to be able to pass the red face test and look at Bill, who is very analytical and will do calculations while you're talking to him, and pass the red face and test and say that I am investing your funds appropriately. So the way we can use our investments is to buy down risk for early stage technology and to trigger dissemination and adoption at scale, because we think you need both of those. So this is an equation that my colleague Rob Horsch, who many of you may know, we kind of wrote this down on napkins at happy hour in Seattle one night and thought about it a lot and talked about it with a lot of people. You can have the best technology in the world, but if it doesn't get widely adopted, zero net impact. Conversely, you can have really crappy technology, and if it is adopted widely, you may even have a net negative impact. We are impact investors, and we need both of these components for sustainable development in our value chain. So we can buy down risk at early stage for folks like many of you here in the room. We can trigger scaling and dissemination by partnering with folks like many of you in the room. And our expectation is that all of these investments across technology and adoption lead to long-term sustainable productivity gains, and that's the impact we're looking for. Within the R&D group of the Ag program, we really have sort of 3 high-level objectives, all of those focused on our end user, our client, the smallholder farmer. As I've discussed a lot, we want to increase their productivity. That means helping contribute to research and product development on improved varieties and breeds that can really enhance their yields and reduce the, increase the efficiency of any inputs. We also are very aware of the need for yield protection, and we want to decrease the risk and volatility. Smallholder farmers are extremely vulnerable to weather and pests and all of the other components that typically farmers in the developing world have good protections against. So we're focused on both intrinsic yield and yield protection. Finally, we're looking at and invest in portfolios around micronutrient availability in staple crops so that they get more nutritional benefit from the crops that they do grow. And we do that in partnership with our nutrition team in the Global Development Program. So we'll invest, and this is just a pie chart snapshot that I put together a couple of years ago, and it hasn't changed all that much. We'll invest in research and development focused on intrinsic yield as well as biotic and abiotic stresses. There may be tools and methods that are required to drive technology development in those areas, and so when it's necessary, we will build that into some of our investments. And we're always interested in omics and systems biology that can have a really high impact on the overall physiology and development of the crops and animals that we work on. So I don't have to go through this. This is one version of what many of you here in the room who have been involved in product development for crops understand. The point I want to make here is that we look at the research and development investments that we make from a product development lens. And that is the translational piece that we're interested in. Now, we have the potential for a higher risk tolerance and in some cases a longer timeline than traditional commercial product developers. But we are really interested in not just science and research for science sake, but in the case of crops, and this is just one example, getting to high-yielding varieties that can be incorporated into the germplasm, typically tropical germplasm, or animal breeds, typically different than the temperate area breeds, that are relevant in the agroecologies we work on, in the tropics, in the desert, in the developing world. So we view the investments we make from a product development lens, and that is the key to translation of the science. Now, we may invest in basic science on the hypothesis that it will open up new avenues for crop improvement, and I'll go into that in a little bit more, but it always has to have some lens into translation and like stuff at the end of the day, okay? Whether it's an improved crop, whether it's an improved breed, whether it's a tool that can be deployed or a better practice. There has to be some stuff at the end of the day. We think that one really effective way to make stuff is to have public and private partnerships as part of our investment portfolio. So when we think about this, we really try and think about the win-win, because quite frankly, the markets that we work on are not profitable markets for commercial sector entities. So what we're really looking for is a win-win where a solution can have an application and an impact in the developing world, but potentially be a monetizable asset in the developed world. And that's not easy to do. But one of the best ways to do that are some of the best practices when it comes to public-private partnerships that we not only encourage but expect in our investments. So I'm not going to go through the list. I think probably the most difficult one of these win-win criteria is that balanced power piece. So we spend a lot of time and work crafting our investments and the teams that we invest in to ensure that there is a understanding and appreciation of the shared common objective. We don't try and recapitulate the investment that the private sector is making, particularly in high-value commodities. Well, maybe not so high value these days, like corn. But we focus on complementary investment. So what can we bring that is unique and different? What can we invest in that is unique and different than what is already being invested in? A question that will always be asked when we are reviewing our potential investments is, would this happen without us? Because if the answer is yes, then our resources are probably better used elsewhere. We'll work with anybody. So we source technology and innovation and good science and good ideas globally, even though we're targeting our impact to those specific geographies that I told you about. We'll work with public sector as well as private sector entities, and in the best case scenario, bring those complementary expertise and perspectives together. This is just a snapshot, a cartoon I put together of some of our discovery portfolio to give you a feel for both the breadth of what we invest in, as well as, in some cases, the risk tolerance that we're prepared to absorb. So we'll start from the center of the diagram with those high-level sort of areas we want to improve, and then we do a lot of analysis to identify the key constraints to productivities in all of these characters, like, in all of these components, like water and nitrogen and soil health. And then within each of those, we can employ a lot of different approaches, including modern technologies. Yes, we do support the development of transgenic crops. We also have genome editing widely embedded within our portfolio. And so we're really we take a project approach, but we start with the problem and then look for a solution. One of the, I think, the real unique differentiators we bring is because we have a very high risk tolerance, we're really looking for innovation and invention. So a lot of these kinds of investments that we're doing, for example, C4 rice, which some of you may be familiar with, it's really opening up a new paradigm for crop improvement. Like, okay, we're going to make rice have Krantz anatomy and do C4 photosynthesis. The idea's been around for a long time. Now all of a sudden, maybe because of synthetic biology and molecular genetics and genomics, we have some tools that are going to enable us to do that and create a new paradigm for crop improvement. So this is just kind of a snapshot of a few of the many investments we have in the discovery space. And to focus down on nitrogen, let me put that in the context of the overall nitrogen portfolio that we have within our foundation and AgDev. So we have some discovery investments that were illustrated in the previous slide. We also support breeding programs, particularly in the public sector, where they focus on the germplasm and the varieties that are relevant to our agroecology. We have some solutions that are common in the United States and developed world, but not necessarily widely disseminated in the developing world, such as rhizobium inoculants for legumes. We have investments in soil health, again, specifically for Africa, where we are looking and have been for many years investing in data and some of the information technology tools that we've heard a lot about. And then, of course, there's always opportunities for innovation and invention in some other areas. So we constantly build and add on to our portfolio. Stuff and services, that's what comes out of this, goods and services. So that's just one example of our numerous portfolios. And I think I'll leave it at that, except to say that, you know, we really believe in agriculture, obviously. But we also, I mean, we were founded by a businessman, and we try and employ business best practices. We believe that financial security is a strong incentive. And in order to get to a position of financial security, we're trying to drive at a systems level the economic transformation in the countries we live in. And agriculture is one of those levers, and a really important one, so that this little gal here maybe will have a better life than her parents. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Vipula. I know I was not here at the time when you made your much-promised joke at my expense, so I'm going to have to ask you about that later.
I'd be happy to tell you.
Oh, wonderful. Please go ahead. Did you also tell them that you were my wife by some strange act
Don't
of
go there. Don't
magic?
go there.
Let's
Don't
not
go
go there. Okay. Let's not even go there, yeah. But interesting name, by the way, the Shukla name. If you want to be able to talk about that, I'm happy to talk about ancestry and the relationship between us and Genghis Khan, and whether she knows it or not, she is in fact a descendant of his, just like I am. So
it's amazing how he can turn it back to himself.
Questions? Anybody has any questions? We're running a little behind, so we'll try and rush through this here quickly. Any questions or comments? Yes, Charlie.
You mentioned certain countries as priorities. How focused are you on just those countries? Do you consider other countries? I mean, I saw you saw, in East Africa, you consider Kenya. That wasn't one of the ones that you
As a direct priority country, no. But we anticipate that our investments in Tanzania and Ethiopia have spillover effects into Kenya. And one thing I didn't mention, as we're looking at these priority countries, they change as the socioeconomic and political situation changes. So Ethiopia, in many ways, is well on its way to agricultural transformation. They've had a lot of success over the years. We used to focus on Rwanda. It has also evolved quite a lot. We're reconsidering really what we can do in Nigeria given some of the political violence that's taking place there. I mean, the last thing we want is our folks and our partners to be in personal danger. So it changes as the geopolitical and security situation changes. The agricultural situation doesn't really change all that much. That's sort of a more longer term thing.
But there's certain areas, Vipula, that you guys have been involved in for years and will probably continue on, like India and South Asia. Those particular geographies remain a sort of constant in your approach.
India but specific parts of India.
Specific parts of it.
And Bangladesh, yeah.
Okay. Yes, Vijay.
Do you have an example of a company that was able to make an economic success come out of doing things in the developing world? Innovation, access to children.
Yeah. So an either Africa or India-based company. Yeah. In the agriculture sector, that's been a little bit of a challenge because the government is quite heavy-handed in a lot of the countries that we work in. So the entry for us into the private sector is a little more difficult. That being said, one of the investments that I had up on the nitrogen example, N2 Africa, is working very closely with a number of input distributors. These are mom and pop shop businesses that are selling the rhizobium inoculants on the ground in 11 different countries at this point, and they are realizing revenue and generating profit in those cases.
We'll leave it at that. Vipula's going to be around for lunch as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.